And here we are starting part 3 of the mini bike build, and we're moving on to some paint. We're painting the fenders here. Again, as mentioned in the previous video, I typically use a roll bar paint. This is a Rust-Oleum semi-gloss, and it does take a little bit of time to dry. I would not recommend it, but it seems to be holding up well now. And now we need to take care of that rust. I've got some rust remover. This is the rust on the bottom of the fork leg. The right-hand side fork leg had a lot of rust. And next we're going to move back to the wire wheel brush attached to the buffer. Getting the kickstand as well as the pegs. Really easy way to clean these up fast, get those small areas. We're going to move to the frame next. Again, we're going to use a wire wheel brush attached to an air tool. Make quick work of it. After we're done, we'll wipe it down. We'll take some Scotch-Brite to it and then wipe it down again in preparation for paint. Here are the foot pegs and the kickstand. Primed them, and now we're shooting some of that same paint we used for the fenders, that Rust-Oleum. Here's the frame, priming it as well. Now, as mentioned in the previous video, I did not prime the fenders. Wasn't going to do it, but I decided to prime the entire frame. Here it is, and then we paint it, and here's the finished product. I used 3 coats of paint on everything that we painted. Here's the rear brake. Those old pads, they weren't the best, but they're still usable, so I cleaned them off with some simple green first because they were really dirty, and then I went ahead and sanded them down with a 1200 grit sandpaper just to get them nice and somewhat new. And after that, I used some brake clean, which I do not show in the video. Go ahead and reinstall your piston as well as your pads and then your spacer. Now, this is actually a spring. Basically a piece of metal shaped like a V, and it keeps the pads from touching one another. So when your brakes are off, this will create a tension that spreads the pads apart so they're not rubbing against your disc. And now we'll go ahead and check to make sure they're functioning properly, and they are as good as new. Go ahead and reinstall them onto the frame over the rear disc. You'll notice the rear wheel is on. I, for some reason, did not get footage of me installing that rear wheel. I'm not sure if the camera didn't record or what happened, but it's on there. I didn't want to take it back off. Now we're reinstalling the front forks. Go ahead and slide your spacers and everything in there and crank it down. Now it's time to move to the front wheel. Go ahead and get your spacers lined up. There's 2 spacers on this particular bike. The left-hand side is shorter than the right-hand side. You'll notice I actually painted these as well. The same paint, the Rust-Oleum, 3 coats. Now we move on to the kickstand. I'm really glad I ended up taking off the kickstand and the pegs because there was a lot of buildup in tight spaces that would have just created all kinds of problems in the future. The paint would have chipped very easily. Go ahead and tighten it down, and there's a nut that goes in the back. I put that on as well, and we're also putting on the spring. The spring just allows it to stay up. You can see it functions properly. It's real easy to put on, and there we go. Now we're going to move on to the fenders, starting with the front. Go ahead and put your rubber washers in between the fender and the bracket, your nuts and screws. Tighten those up, and same thing with the rear. Now we're going to move on to the pegs. Go ahead and insert the peg, then the pin, along with the spring, and then make sure they function properly. Now in part 4, we're going to go ahead and put the cotter pins in the pegs and the wheels. I didn't do that here. Then I go ahead and sit the motor in the frame to kind of mock it up. And then I take the clutch off the old motor, and here's where I realized that I have a 3/4 inch shaft on the new motor. This clutch will not work. So stay tuned for part 4 when we finish up the motor and the other odds and ends.